You will learn about Git and Git workflow. To use Git on a computer, you must install Git on the computer. Git will only keep track of files in directories that have been initialized with Git. Let's say you initialize a working directory with Git. Git will initialize the working directory with a .git directory. The .git directory is also known as a repository. The repository for the working directory essentially contains the database that Git will use to keep track of changes made to files in the working directory. The working directory initialized with Git is also associated with a staging area. When you create a new file in an empty working directory initialized with Git, Git will be aware of the existence of the file but will not keep track of changes made to the file. If you want Git to keep track of changes made to the file, you will have to add the file to the staging area. This marks the file for the next commit. When you carry out the next commit, Git will create a snapshot of all the files in the staging area as an entry to the repository. This entry is the first version of the file. Each commit is a snapshot or version of all the files you have added to the staging area. If you make more changes to the same file after the first commit, you will have to mark that file for the next commit by adding it to the staging area. Whenever you add a file to the staging area, it is eligible for the next commit. When you carry out the next commit, a snapshot of the files in the staging area will be taken and added to the repository. You can also check out an earlier version or snapshot from the repository. All you have learned so far has to do with using Git on your local computer. It is also possible to have the Git on your local computer connected to a remote server. The remote repository will be identical to your local repository. If at any time the local repository is ahead of the remote repository, you can update the remote repository by pushing the local repository to the remote repository. It is also possible to update the local repository by pulling from the remote repository. Generally, when you work on a file in a directory initialized with Git, you will decide when it is time to add that file in its current state to the staging area for the next commit. When you run the next commit, a snapshot of all the files in the staging area will be taken and entered into the local repository. You can then push the local repository to the remote repository to update the remote repository. If the remote repository is ahead of the local repository, you can pull the remote repository to update the local repository. You can check out any version of the local repository. You will learn more about merge subsequently. Earlier, I mentioned that Git takes a snapshot of the files in the staging area as a version of your working directory. Let's assume you have created 3 files in your working directory: file A, file B, and file C.
Although the three files are in a working directory set up with Git, that is initialized with the .git directory, Git will not keep track of these files unless you add them to the staging area. When you add them to the staging area, you mark them for the next commit. When you carry out the next commit, Git will take a snapshot of the files in the staging area as a version of your working directory. And this will be the first version of the files in the working directory. Let's say you make changes to file A and file C, and you decide that you want to add file A and file C in their current state to the staging area. That marks file A and file C for the next commit. When you carry out the next commit, Git will take a snapshot of the staging area as a second version of your working directory. This second version will not include file B. Instead, it will only hold a reference to file B. The reference to file B will refer to file B in version 1. This is because file B was not added to the staging area for the last commit. Let's say you now go ahead to make changes to file C in version 2, and you went on to add the file C to the staging area after you have made some changes. That will mark file C for the next commit. When you carry out the next commit, Git will take a snapshot of the staging area as the third version of your working directory. This third version will include file C and references to file B and file A. The reference for file B will refer to file B in version 1, while the reference for file A will refer to file A in version 2. Note that even if there were changes made to file B between version 2 and version 3, because file B was not added to the staging area for the last commit, then it is not part of the commit. Next, assuming you make changes to file A and B, then add file A and B to the staging area for the next commit. If you carry out the next commit, then Git will take a snapshot of the staging area as the fourth version of the working directory. This fourth version will include file A and file B, as well as a reference to file C. The reference to file C will refer to file C in version 3. Let's say you make one final change to file B and file C. If you add file B and C to the staging area, then carry out another commit, Git will take a snapshot of the staging area as the fifth version of your working directory. This fifth version will include file C, file B, as well as a reference to file A. This reference to file A will refer to file A in version 4. So that is how Git uses snapshots of the files in the staging area to create versions of your working directory. It is also possible to ask Git to skip the staging area so that each version is a snapshot of all the files on your working directory. It is also important to note that almost all operations on Git are local operations. That is, they are operations you can carry out on your local computer. You don't have to be connected to a remote site to use Git. Finally, Git ensures the integrity of your files. It is almost impossible to alter the content of Git repository without Git knowing about it.